Hello, everyone, and welcome to Fresh Take from What Fresh Hell Laughing in the Face of Motherhood. This is Margaret.
And this is Amy, and today we're talking to Alyssa Blask Campbell. She is the CEO of Seed and Sow, which supports teachers and families with tools for regulation, connection, and emotional intelligence. Alyssa is also the host of the podcast Voices of Your Village, a new member of Atlas Media, and a gathering place for parents, caregivers, teachers, and experts. It reaches listeners in more than 100 countries. Alyssa is also the author of the new book, Tiny Humans, Big Emotions, How to Navigate Tantrums, Meltdowns, and Defiance to Raise Emotionally Intelligent Children, which is out now from HarperCollins. Welcome, Alyssa.
Thank you. I'm super jazzed to get to hang with you.
So you say in the book that we are actually in the midst of a parenting revolution that is radically changing the way that we raise our kids. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I think we're really starting to see kids as humans. And it's part of the title of this book, Tiny Humans, because I think for a long time we saw them as separate. And a lot of us were raised in this way, like there's kids and there's adults. And here's how kids should act and react and behave, etc. And then there's a different set of rules for adults and how we function and how we move through the world. And I think we're finally starting to see kids as humans and treating them with respect and really aiming for connection above all else.
And part of that is changing the way we advise parents as advice givers and advice receivers. Things like just ignore them and, all sorts of old style parenting advice is kind of going out the window.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Well, I mean, that was how most of us were raised. I mean, we're kids of the 70s. I think you're a child, maybe more of the 80s, but these were not, and we make a lot of jokes how it's like, don't drown. And like, it's Betty Draper sitting there with a cigarette, right? But our parents weren't all so detached from us, but they were following what did seem like best practices, right? Like what the goal of parenting and parenting advice then was to teach a kid to control their stuff by us ignoring it. Or also like, or if we went to them and be like, don't cry, you're a big boy, or take them outside, whatever, right? That we teach kids how to have emotions by teaching them how to control their emotions.
Exactly.
And that was well meant. However,
totally.
What was wrong with that?
It's a know better, do better situation, right? Like I look at, I shared this in the book, but I was at my mom's house and we were just looking through old pictures and there's a picture of me as a baby. And I saw the car seat that I was in, which is like basically a bucket with straps. And now my 2.5-year-old is in like a fortress in comparison to this. And she was like, when I was a kid, we didn't even have car seats, right? So like this was an upgrade. And we do this with some things where we're like, oh yeah, we learned that car seat safety is really helpful for keeping people alive. Here's what that looks like. We evolved the car seat. And the same thing here with social emotional development. There's been a lot of research in the last 30 years that has highlighted how we build emotional intelligence, what this looks like in practice. And now looking back, it's like, yeah, some of those practices, we didn't know any better. We didn't know what this looked like. There hadn't been research to support it. And it makes total sense to me if you're my mom and a kid's having a meltdown and you want to teach them, or a kid's hitting their sibling and you want to teach them, like, that's not how we behave. To just be like, we don't hit and I'm going to punish you for it. Or there's going to be a reward in some capacity when you do something that we want to see, that we're trying to either reinforce behavior we want to see or punish behavior we don't to try and get this end result. Like that makes sense to me, given the research they had at hand. And now we know that behavior is really just a communication of these other needs, and we'll continue to see different behaviors pop up until we can address the needs that are driving them. We've learned more.
And I think it's interesting and it's great to start at the why of this, because I think sometimes people are resistant to the idea of communication. It seems to people, as we say on the podcast, a little tweet, which was Amy's grandmother's expression for things that were a little too much. And I think that people sometimes hear this and what they think of is kids who are completely given their own way and spoiled, and that the opposite of this more restrictive or parenting that doesn't focus on communication is like, well, the kids run the show and they kind of are completely spoiled. So
The spoiled is
what's
the worst thing your kid could be, right? Like that's a word
that's
you don't
right.
hear very much, but a kid who is spoiled is what will happen if you are too indulgent towards them. And then I don't know what would
Totally.
happen. That was a big bad thing, right?
Right.
But
And
then
but
that's
what's
changed.
wrong with that
Mhm.
idea that like, oh, well, listening to kids is somehow this like goofy, indulgent new wave thing?
Sure. Well, I think there is some permissive parenting that's come as like a pendulum swing from this. They're not honored that like
Mm.
that does exist and we are going to see it sometimes. There is that pendulum swing for some folks. And what we're looking at is really that middle ground of like, I'm still going to be the one who sets boundaries and holds them, make sure that you're safe and healthy and you're going to have to do things you don't want to do. My 2.5-year-old will say, Mama, I'm gonna feel disappointed, and I will let him know, like, "Yeah, you're allowed to feel that. Like, that makes sense to feel."
Yeah.
It's not my job to stop him from feeling disappointed. It's my job to allow it, which is the part that many of us didn't get in childhood was the allowing
Mm.
part.
Mm.
And to give him some tools to process it and know that, like, yeah, I can handle your disappointment. It's not too big for me. It doesn't change the boundary. We're still going to do
Mm.
this thing. You're allowed to be disappointed about it. And one of my best friends just yesterday was talking about this interaction where she was on a boat with her dad and her 3-year-old. And the 3-year-old, like, standing up, leaning over the side, trying to look out at the water, and the rule on the boat was it had to be sitting when it was driving so that she doesn't die. And, like, yeah, fair rule. Good job, mom. And so she stands up and she's leaning over, and mom went over and was standing next to her, like, holding her body and telling her the rule again and why this is the rule and helping her then sit back down. And her dad was like, "You're the adult. You don't need to explain this. Just sit her down." And she was
Mm.
like, "Oh, yeah, that is totally how I was raised." Like, yep, just like flashback. You don't need to explain it. And I think that's the part where it can feel like this shift from one generation to the next of like, the boundary is still the same. She's still holding the, you have to sit in the boat when we're driving. But now we're explaining the why. And for so many of us who were like curious kids and got the because I said so as an answer,
Mm.
we're like, cool, that didn't work for us. And now what I learned is just that you're not the one that I'm going to turn to when I'm feeling curious, or you can't handle it when I'm having this hard emotion. And that's what I've learned uh, for so many of us that experience that. And now we're saying to kids, like, yeah, you can ask questions. It's okay to be curious. Doesn't mean the boundary changes.
I
Yeah.
think that is the
That's the
really key
difference.
distinction.
There If you're looking for a why, if you're coming to this saying like, yeah, but like kids just need to learn their place and that's how I was raised and it was good enough for me, it'll be good enough for the kids. Here's the sentence that I bolded in the book and like put it down and was like, wow, I really have to think about this. As you say in the intro to the book, we as adults tend to spend time and therapy and money and self-study learning how to feel stuff and develop coping strategies around the things that we feel. We're doing that as grown-ups because we didn't learn those things as children. And I thought, wow, right? But we
Hmm.
got to learn this stuff and we'll learn it when we're 2 or we'll learn it when we're 42, but we have to learn it.
Yeah. I think a lot of us, like it used to be thought that like, oh, these are just skills that you get, which is why we sometimes still see like age bias where it's like at some point kids should stop crying or they should know how to do X, Y, and Z. And we think of it kind of like walking or talking. We're like, unless there's some underlying challenge, like most kids are going to learn how to walk, whether you provide all the right equipment or not. Most kids are going to learn how to talk and all that. And emotional development isn't like that. It is something that's learned. And you know that when you just pause and look around at the adults in your life and you're like, yeah, a lot of them didn't learn this, right? A lot of them still have a ways to go. And when we're looking at this with kids, we're like, this is something that has to be taught. We have to learn how to tune in to what's happening in our body and what helps us regulate because it's going to be different for all of us. What's calming for me is different than what's calming for my husband. And so being able to learn those things about ourselves. And then once we can do those things, then learning things like empathy and social skills feel way more attainable and accessible.
We're talking to Alyssa Blask Campbell. Her new book is Tiny Humans, Big Emotions: How to Navigate Tantrums, Meltdowns, and Defiance to Raise Emotionally Intelligent Children. And we'll be right back.
So, Alyssa, let's talk about this idea of emotional intelligence. I feel like that's a word that is thrown around in so many different contexts. Some people have a very positive association with it. There are certainly people who have a very negative association with it. Talk a little bit about what that term means.
Yeah, it's super buzzwordy and, like, I'm
Yes.
jazzed. I'm jazzed that it's buzzwordy. I'm so glad we're talking about it.
But what is it?
But
And
like all
But
buzzwords,
what is it though?
it sort of
Correct.
becomes a thing that people are like, I don't know what it is, but I don't like it. Or I don't know
Correct.
what it is, but I love it, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah. Oh, 100%. So when we're looking at emotional intelligence, there are a few different, like, definitions of it. We have 5 components of emotional intelligence. And generally in research, you'll find at least 4 of these. We have self-awareness, self-regulation, empathy, social skills, and motivation, looking at intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. And that all those 5 together come together to make up emotional intelligence. So are you able to notice what you're feeling inside, what's happening for you inside before you're exploding? Are you able to then tap into tools to regulate, to get back into a space where you can have a conversation, where you can problem solve, you can navigate conflict resolution, where you can control your tone or your words? Um, and then we look at things like empathy, right? Are you able to look at someone and say, oh man, I know what that feeling feels like? Not I have experienced that thing before. Not, I'm going to quote, put myself in your shoes and say, like, I've walked that walk, but just that you know that feeling. And I share this in the book, but there was a kid who was building with magnet tiles. Somebody bumps into it. Magnet tile tower crashes. And in my head, I'm like, it's not a big deal. You can build it again, right? Like, not the end of the
To
world.
you, not a
But
big deal, right? And for
correct.
you,
Exactly.
right?
For me, I'm like, this isn't a big deal. And then I pop in and I like try to say the right words, but inside I'm like, yeah, this is the end of the world. And then fast forward to I had just folded 5 baskets of laundry. I have these piles all over my living room. My 2.5-year-old comes in and knocks down my piles. And
Mm.
in that moment, if you were like, hey, Alyssa, don't worry, you can fold it again. Like,
Calm down.
yeah,
Right.
let's take
Big
some deep
deal.
breaths and figure this out together. I'm like, no, like, absolutely
Just
not.
mad.
Yeah, I need time to feel mad. Do I know that I have to fold it again later? Totally. Do I want to? No. And I'm in that space right now where I just get to have a feeling. And that's where empathy comes in. It's when we empathize with that feeling. I know what it feels like to feel disappointed or frustrated. I can empathize with somebody else feeling that, whether I agree with why they're feeling it or not. Social skills is the part of like, I can read the room. I know how to show up with my grandma versus with my best friend. I know how to show up in school or in a religious community versus like I'm hanging out with pals or I'm at home, right? And that differentiation, the ability to differentiate those things, is where we're looking at social skills. And this could come into like, how do I speak to one person versus another? Uh, and then we have motivation. This is that intrinsic versus extrinsic. And the goal isn't that we always have intrinsic motivation. Sometimes it's like, yeah, when I finish this thing, I'm going to reward myself in some capacity, like cheers. But if we're always reliant on extrinsic motivation, then what we start to see is less productivity and kids who truly just like don't feel proud of themselves, right? So
Mm.
they're always looking outside to say, are you proud of me? Have I met your standards? Versus, I'm really proud of what I did here. I feel
Mm.
proud of this.
And as you list these as a parent of a kid who is on the spectrum, I immediately think these are all things that kids with ADD, autism, different developmental difficulties, 5 for 5 generally struggle with a lot
Hmm.
of these things. And so talk about that for a moment, and are the techniques and the approaches that you talk about in the book useful for all kids? And obviously it's something that all kids I know need to work on, but it seems like, oh wait, these are the big ticket things that I know kids who are developmentally different
Sure.
struggle with.
Yeah. So I don't believe in a one size fits all approach in the same way that I shared, like my husband and I have different ways to regulate, right? Like our
Mhm.
nervous system's different. When we're looking at neurodivergence, what we're really looking at is that we all process stimuli in the world differently and make sense of it differently. And what we do in part 1 of the book is get a little nerdy with you. We break down that neuroscience and like what's happening in the brain and the body and how are we different and how can we learn about ourselves and then the child in front of us and who they are as their unique self. That
Mm.
my 2.5-year-old is sensory sensitive. And so when we go into a space, I know that he is so good at noticing stimuli. He notices sounds. He notices how things feel tactily, like if something's too tight or it's itchy or whatever. And he will notice if something changes in the environment. He remembers details so well and is so observant. And from this, his nervous system can get overwhelmed faster than somebody who misses a lot of details like me. I'm like never the human who should edit your thing. I'm 100% going to miss the details. And my nervous system can handle more stimuli at a time than his can because
Mm.
we have different nervous systems. And so then how we respond to kids in the moment, how we support them proactively throughout the day, how we teach these skills will be designed specifically for them and their nervous system. That what
Mm.
I need in the moment or outside of the moment is going to be a little different than what he needs. And so in the book, we're not like, here's the approach, you do this and then you do this. It's more, let's look at who they are. And then we can help you figure out of if we're trying to teach these skills, what are some different approaches that might be helpful?
In fact, it seems to me like extra useful in some ways because I know that a lot of people I know who have kids who are neurodivergent, they find much more that trying to interact with family who is like, well, back in my day, we just sat through dinner. And back in my day, we didn't talk during church. And it's like, okay, but we kind of understand now that there are kids who really struggle with this. And it's not just that back in your day it worked. It's that we just ignored these kids and their
Well, they were
needs.
afraid.
Correct.
They were frightened that
Yes.
you would hit them. So I guess that worked for you. It didn't work for those kids.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, then they lived in just trauma. Yeah. Like a trauma
Right.
response and
Right. But they were
fear.
quiet. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Or they were sent to their room and you could come out when you were ready to come out,
Right. So
you
the book,
know?
despite your saying that it's a very not a one size fits all approach, nor should it be, you do have a sort of overall approach that you introduce in this book, way to
Yeah,
approach this work. That's called collaborative emotion processing. And so walk us through that.
totally. Yeah, the SEP method, collaborative emotion processing, and it's 5 components. One is adult-child interaction. So we look at what might it look like to respond to them, et cetera, and it's not prescriptive within that. There's differentiation within that. And then the other 4 are about us, which is the doozy, right? Like we're like, "Oh yeah, tell me what to say or do with my kid." And we're like, "Sure, sure, sure. Let's start with what's coming up for you."
Yes, always such a
There's
bummer. We're like,
homework.
"Here's the bad news, guys. It's you. You're the problem. It's
Exactly.
you."
Exactly. So like you were saying that so many of us didn't grow up with this and now we're learning this as
Yeah.
adults. And so we have to learn this as adults, right? So we have self-awareness in there for us as adults. We have self-care, which for us is like the nervous system part of how are you taking care of your nervous system? What does it look like to take care of you? And that's going to be different for everyone. Also super buzzwordy. And for us, it's not like a weekend away. It's like, hey, are you drinking enough water? Have you had enough food? Are you moving your body? Are you asking for help or setting boundaries where it makes sense for you? What are ways you're taking care of yourself? And then we have uncovering implicit bias. This is where we dive into that childhood social programming. What are your triggers? What are the stories you're telling yourself in the moment when that child has a public meltdown or they're at the dinner table with your parents? And they're not just sitting there at the dinner table. They're melting down or they're getting up, they're bopping around. And now you also have the voice of your father saying, well, back in my day, kids just sat at the table. And that voice literally lives inside of you. And it's going to come up whether your parents are there or not. And so noticing those biases and kind of what to do with that, the triggers part of
Mm.
it. And then we have the scientific knowledge. This is where we get nerdy and dive into the sensory systems and how our bodies work and our brains work and how we're all different in that sense.
On this podcast, we love for part 3 to be about solutions. We're going to take a break. And when we come back, we're going to put this into practice. We're talking to Alyssa Blask Campbell. She is the host of Voices of Your Village podcast and the author of Tiny Humans, Big Emotions. So everybody listening right now is like, this sounds good, but so I am in church and my kid is standing on a pew and yelling, or I am at the dinner table with my parents and my kid is carrying on. Like, then what? So let's talk about some of these situations. So say you're in a public place, Target. That's always our example, right? I feel like we always talk about like your
Gotta be
kid
Target.
is throwing a hissy in Target aisle 6.
Aisle 6.
Drawing stares. You're definitely a little bit concerned about what the lady over there who's, looking at you thinks.
And that person might actually be vocalizing like, well,
sure.
we
Back
certainly did not
she's
behave like
actually
that
saying,
back in my
back in
She's
my day.
literally saying back in my day.
Yeah. What do we do in that moment as an emotionally intelligent parent?
Sure. Well, first, like, I literally lived this the other day, um, as a mom with a 2.5-year-old. Uh, and truthfully, like, he is on the ground. He was disappointed that he couldn't have what he wanted. He hadn't had a snack on the way
the
to
no snack trip to Target.
Mhm.
Yes.
Like, we got
Booze,
up
no
from
snack.
nap, and usually we'll, like, have a snack at home, and then we'll, like, go off and do things. And I just had an agenda, and so I popped him in the car and gave him a snack in the car, and he didn't eat it. And so he's going into this trip a little dysregulated. And the not getting to have the thing he wants in Target's the tip of the iceberg, right? And so when he starts to like melt and throws his body on the ground, first I go into like scan to say like, is
Sure.
everything safe, right? Is he going to throw something? Is he hurting anybody else? Is he hurting himself? If he starts banging his head on the ground, like I'll step in and I'll move his body or I'll put something under it. So I'm looking first at just like safety and we'll step in as needed there. Next, if everyone's safe, is me. This is where I am going to take a beat and say like, all right, he is safe. He's not banging his head. He's not throwing anything. His body's laying on the ground. He is mad. He is crying and screaming. This sucks. It's embarrassing. And I'm going to calm here. I'm going to regulate. So I just take some deep breaths while I'm watching him lose it on the floor. And maybe that lady's saying something. And I'm literally just like, that's her bag to carry, not mine. He's having a hard time. This is where I'll take deep breaths. And I usually have like a mantra for myself, like a phrase. Otherwise, I'm just like taking deep breaths and still fuming. But while I'm taking
Right.
some
Those
breaths.
deep breaths become like,
yeah, exactly.
rageful deep breaths.
Exactly. So I'll take some deep breaths. And I usually have a mantra of like, he's having a hard time. Or in my head, I'm like, he's hungry. It's just going to take a minute. Like just reminding myself, coming back to like what's happening right now and tuning out truthfully the rest of the world in that moment with my own like reminders of like my go-to is like, that's her bag to carry. Like that's about her. It's not about me is what reminds me in the moment. And then I stepped over and I sat down next to him, our cart's sitting right there. And he's saying, leave me alone, go away. And I sat down next to him. And I sat down next to him and I was like, you really want to get this right now. And it's not a choice. I'm going to be here with you. Pause. That's it. Like, I'm going to be here with you. And he just like kept crying, go away, leave me alone. And I'm just like there. I'm not right up next to his body, but I'm staying near him. And I'm like, I'm going to wait this out. He's hungry, right? Like, I know what it feels like to be hangry. I've been in this place where it's like tip of the iceberg, something happens. And right now, he's not ready to accept food and he's going to get there. He's just not there yet. No, if I had like a timeline agenda, other kids, I might even pick him up and say like, buddy, I'm going to move you into the cart. You can still feel upset. I just have to get your siblings or we have to leave the store. I might still move through this while he gets to feel. And letting that happen. In this instance, I like had a beat. We could pause. I did have a timeline at some point with like another thing we had to go do. And I ended up cutting off his like moment of laying and moved him. And I was like, I'm going to carry you. I'm just going to go. We did the self-checkout and I just like checked things out as he's crying and I'm holding him. And we got out to the car. And when we were walking out of the car, I was actually walking out of Target and this other mom was like, oh, God, I've been there. And I was like, you know what? Thanks. Like that. Thank you. Yeah. It's not fun. I'm not like, I'm having a great time right now. We got into the car. When we got into the car, they got him buckled in and he's like crying and yelling throughout this whole thing. When we got into the car and got him buckled, he had a snack, like that snack that he didn't eat was right there. And eventually when we were driving, he started to eat and then he started to calm and then we could talk about it. And I was like, oh man, you really wanted to have that toy and your body felt so out of control. Whew.
Let me put this in the context of a situation because I hear you,
Yeah.
but I'm thinking about a situation where a crying child is much more disruptive, right? Like a funeral. Or I know somebody who
Or a wedding.
recently
Right.
they were traveling. They went on like a sunset cruise. They
Yeah.
did not realize when they booked it, it was somewhere far away. Oh my gosh, this is like a high-end fancy. Like people paid a
Sure.
lot of money to be here. And her kid went full meltdown.
Yeah.
And it's like, wait a minute, we're actually destroying like 30 other people's good time.
Yeah.
And
I'll
while
remove the kid.
you just pull, that's where you just, so you do this, you take them out of the situation
Correct.
and then you have the same conversation.
Correct.
Do
The
you
same
ever say
process.
like, it is okay to feel these feelings, but
I want to. I
Yeah,
really want to. But in actuality, like I set this kid up for failure. If I'm in like a fancy place where they don't get to be a
yes,
kid
yes,
and have feelings and express in a way that like with all the tools they have in this moment, and then they are a kid and they have feelings and they express in all the ways they can in this moment. And I'm like, oh shoot, this isn't convenient for me.
right.
That's about me. That's about my bag to carry. That's about the behavior I'm hoping they will elicit on the surface when I put them into the situation. And
Yes.
so for me, I'm like, all right, part of this is like, yeah, if I'm going to go to this fancy dinner, I'm going to do this thing that he can't just be a kid, then that means I'm out at some point
Might have
have
to
to have
take
the
him out.
expectation that I might have to take him out
Yeah.
or we might have to step away. And I will also just do this at our own like dinner table.
Hmm.
If we have, especially if like people are over, we're in a group, I am in the camp of like, you can have a hard time and everyone else still gets to like hang out and talk and enjoy their time. And you don't have to be alone. Like I will carry him away from the table and I will process with him and hold space with him and stay with him. So it's not like, here, go to your room and come back when you're ready. Uh, but also everyone else gets to hang out and have a good time still if that's what they want to do. Like it doesn't get to be all about you.
And you
Yeah.
do this, like, say, in this situation, is there ever a situation where you think, okay, I'm going to stay at the table. It's my friends. I haven't seen them in 3 months. Here's the iPad. Like, just go sniffle on the couch and I'll be back in a few minutes. What is the shortcoming of that approach?
Sure. So for me, if using a screen makes me a better parent, I'm here to use it. Right. So
Mm.
just recently, my husband was traveling for work and I'm 7 billion weeks pregnant and I have a 2-year-old. And I like got to the place where I couldn't handle it. Right. Like I was overwhelmed and tired and under resourced and had no one to tap out to. And so I turned on Daniel Tiger, which I knew he would like zone out to for 15 minutes or 20 minutes. And it gave me 15 or 20 minutes to like calm down, come back from this, have a snack. And I'm not like coming back to this as if I left the spa and I'm in like the most zen place ever. I'm just
Right.
like, how can I
It's only
regulate
Daniel
enough?
Tiger. I
It's
mean,
the Daniel Tiger.
It's only
But I'm
22
like, can
minutes.
I
that
get
much of Daniel
myself?
Tiger.
But it's really for me, right? Like
Yes.
for him, and we break this down in the book of like when we're tapping into things like screens, we're tapping into dopamine, which is a temporary relief for the nervous system. So we're like numbing the nervous system. And what I know is like whatever was driving the meltdown before this is gonna surface again,
Mm.
usually within like 15 or 20 minutes of that screen going off, if not right away. And
Mm.
so I need to come back to this knowing we're going to enter back in to whatever was just happening in a little bit. And so this break that I'm getting from this screen is for me to recharge enough to be able to come back.
Okay. That makes sense. Yeah, these approaches are not necessarily magic solutions, right? It occurs to me listening to this. And then when you say, I understand that you're so upset you didn't get to have the toy, he doesn't sit up and wipe his eyes and be like, great, mommy. Like, it's not a magic bullet.
You've really heard me, Mom.
It's
I'm
but
now going to
it's
just give you a break and
right.
behave well in Target.
But on the other hand, it doesn't work so well when we're like, you stop it right now. I am never taking you to Target again. Like, guess what? That also doesn't immediately work. But at
Yeah,
least this leads to a healthy and emotionally healthy grown-up.
exactly. And that we get to ultimately be in relationship with each other and be connected
Mm.
with each other. And like, that's my goal. I've never set boundaries for kids. And they were like, wow, I can't wait to follow it. Thank you so much for setting that for me. I can tell you really care about me. Like, that's not what's going to happen. And it can't be our expectation. I think so often we're like, if we do all these things, we will be regulated all the time. They will be regulated all the time. And we'll just all speak kindly to each other all the time. And that's not how humans work. That's not how nervous systems work. Like we cycle in and out of dysregulation all the time. And what we're really doing is saying, we're going to allow for that cycle with some boundaries around how you can express and how you can't.
That is great. This was a good conversation for me today. I'm dealing with this with my teens, and let me tell you, it
Tell us
gets
about your
better, but a little still stays.
It's different, just
well,
gets
that was a
different.
point that your publicity materials made, and I wanted to underline. The book is called Tiny Humans, Big Emotions, but it doesn't mean that it's only for tiny humans, this book.
No. Yeah. I use the sub method with every relationship in my life. I use it with my husband. I use it across the board because so much of it is about us. And then it's just how do we interact with the other human once we're navigating our own stuff with intention.
We're going to put a link to Tiny Humans, Big Emotions and all the places you can buy it in the show notes. But Alyssa, tell us a little bit about your work at Seed and Sow.
Yeah, sweet. Thanks. I started Seed after the research ended for the SET method. I just wanted to be able to share it more broadly with folks, and people seemed to be hungry for it. So we grew to a social global community of over 300,000 pretty quickly and have a number of resources. We have parent and caregiver resources. We have a professional development program for early childhood educators to support teachers in doing this work. And we have the podcast, Voices of Your Village, and now the book as a guide for folks to do this.
And tell us a little bit, because we are super interested, as you are a new member of Atlas Media, about the Voices of the Village podcast and what people can expect when they now tune in to listen.
Sure. Yeah, I found for myself, I have a master's in early ed, and I was going to all these conferences, and I just had access to a lot of experts and folks to lean on, to learn from. And most people don't have that, especially in parenting and raising kids. And I wanted to bring that to people. So I do interviews with folks, bringing all different topics from hitting and kicking and biting to like, how do we do this differently than we were raised with
Mm.
all the things that are coming up for us? Every week we drop an episode on Thursday and really looking for like shame free, judgment free. Let's just like hang out like we're having a cup of coffee together and get a little nerdy sometimes.
Fantastic. We will also link to the podcast in the show notes. Check it out and go subscribe. And Alyssa, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thanks, Alyssa.